Hello, my name is John O'Brien, and I'd like to welcome you to the Massachusetts Statehouse. This has been the seat of our state government for 213 years. Two of the three branches of government are located here, the executive and the legislative. The judicial branch is around the corner at the John Adams Courthouse. The building was designed by an architect named Charles Bulfinch. He was the first native-born architect here in America. He also went on to design many other buildings here in Boston, including the Ether Dome down at Mass General Hospital, the enlarged Faneuil Hall Marketplace, and St. Stephen's Church. He was also called in to supervise construction of the dome down at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and they hired him for that job because they were impressed with his design of this domed building here. The building was started construction in 1795 on July 4th. They had a ceremony where they brought the cornerstone from the old State House to the new State House, pulled on a wagon by 15 white horses representing the 15 states in the Union. They had a Masonic ceremony, and Governor Sam Adams and Paul Revere spoke at that ceremony, and construction began. It took about 2.5 years for them to complete the building, and what they did was this red brick front section. It's referred to as the Bulfinch front. It's the oldest part of the building. It was finished in 1798, and our state government has been located here since then. The model behind me shows the original building. It's fairly small, about 65 feet wide. The model has a few inaccuracies to it. Back in 1798, they had chimneys. The building was heated by fireplace. They also had side entrances. The most notable change involves the dome. The dome was always part of the building, but it wasn't always golden. Originally, it was just wood shingles like the rest of the roof. But very soon after construction was finished, the roof began to leak. They went back to the contractor to complain about this. The contractor was Paul Revere. His solution was to cover the dome in copper. He had just opened the first copper sheeting factory in America. So they covered the dome with copper in 1802. Copper, when it's exposed to air, though, begins to oxidize and turn green. They didn't like that look. So in 1874, they first gilded the dome with 23-karat gold leaf. And gold leaf, it's a very thin sheet of gold, thinner than a sheet of paper. They wrap the dome with that. Roughly about every 50 or so years, they do have to regild it. The last time it was done was in preparation for the building's bicentennial back in 1998. Up above the golden dome, there's a large gold pine cone. The pine cone is there to symbolize the importance of the lumber industry to Massachusetts, keeping in mind that when the building was built, Maine and all of its forests were part of Massachusetts' economy. As we go through the building, you'll find there are a lot of symbols here to remind the senators and representatives and other visitors to the building about Massachusetts and its history. We're now in Doric Hall. At one time, Doric Hall was the main meeting and public reception area here at the State House. They would have large public hearings, speeches, rallies, and official state dinners honoring visiting presidents and dignitaries such as Davy Crockett. The name comes from the 10 Doric-style columns that line the center of the room. Doric columns are the simplest form of column. They just have a square base at the bottom. Ionic columns have the scrolls, Corinthian columns have the leaves. This room nowadays is used primarily as an area for visiting art displays. There are boards around the room that different exhibits will come in. They usually stay for a week or two and then move out. The room also houses several of the permanent pieces here in our State House art collection. Up at the center of the room is the first piece of artwork that was put in place here in the building. It's a statue of George Washington. You would think that would be a safe choice for the first piece of art, but there was a little bit of controversy when the statue was unveiled. The sculptor was an Englishman, Sir Francis Chantrey, and he draped Washington in a toga to symbolize his role as a statesman and a scholar. The Americans were used to seeing Washington portrayed as a military general in his uniform, and they felt that by putting him in the toga, it made him look too much like an emperor or king, which was an image that Washington tried to downplay. So for a time, it was thought that this statue would not be put on display until a newspaper published a preview of it, saying that the statue portrayed Washington emerging from his tent at Valley Forge, wrapped in an army blanket. And with that story, the statue was unveiled, but we can admit that it actually is a toga. The hall also contains a full-length portrait of our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. And it's a very rare portrait because it is full-length of Lincoln. Lincoln was very self-conscious about his height. He stood about 6'4", and the average height of the man at the time was about 5'8". He did not like to have full-length artwork of himself done. This painting was done using some of the photographs that Matthew Brady had taken during the Civil War as models. Lincoln had passed away, so he had no say as to whether this portrait would be done or not. Two interesting things about this portrait. If you look closely at the face, it may look familiar. This was the face that they used on the $5 bill prior to it being redesigned in the early 2000s. Another feature of the portrait is that Lincoln has one of his arms tucked behind his back. This was a cost-saving measure that the Commonwealth used. Artists would charge by the amount of limbs that they had to paint. Obviously it involved more material and much more time. Hands were notoriously difficult to paint realistically. So by having his arm tucked behind his back, the Commonwealth had to pay less, and it's from this practice that the expression "something costing an arm and a leg" comes from. In the corner of the room, there's a statue of Governor John Andrew. Andrew was the governor of Massachusetts during the Civil War, and he was a close friend and confidant of Abraham Lincoln. He knew that Lincoln was going to need troops and supplies when war was declared. There was not a federal army that the president could rely on. He depended on the individual governors raising their militias and contributing it to the cause. And Andrew was an ardent abolitionist, very much opposed to slavery, and it was here in Doric Hall that he personally mustered the first troops from the Massachusetts 6th Regiment, armed them, gave them their supplies, and sent them down south. Governor Andrew was also the governor who formed the 54th Regiment during the Civil War. That was the first all African American regiment during the Civil War. The movie Glory is based on part of their history. Governor Andrew comes back later in the tour, up in the governor's office. His portrait is hanging above our current Governor Deval Patrick's desk. Each governor gets to pick a portrait from the collection to serve as inspiration and as a role model, and Governor Patrick chose John Andrew because of his strong abolitionist stance at the start of the Civil War. In the center of the wall, there's a bronze bust of John Hancock. Hancock is very important to the State House for several reasons. First and foremost, it's probably because of Hancock and his family that the State House is where it is today. Back in 1795, when they were looking for somewhere to build the new State House, they were drawn to this neighborhood. Beacon Street was getting developed. They thought Beacon Hill would lend the building a feeling of prominence. The problem was that the land already had some tenants. This was John Hancock's cow pasture. His house was located over where the West Lawn is located today, and his cows graze freely here on Beacon Hill. Hancock had passed away, but his heirs did sell the land to the state, moving their cattle down to Boston Common, and the State House was able to be constructed. Hancock was also famous for signing the Declaration of Independence, first and largest. He wrote his name in such large lettering so that the King of England, King George III, would be able to read it without putting on his glasses. Hancock also has the distinction of being the first freely elected governor of Massachusetts. So he was the first one elected by the citizens and not appointed by the king. He was a very popular governor and was re-elected 10 times. Back then, though, the term of office was just 1 year, so he served 11 one-year terms, making him the most elected governor in Massachusetts history, but not the longest serving. That honor falls to Michael Dukakis, who served for 3 four-year terms. When you exit Doric Hall, you're also exiting the oldest part of the building and stepping into the addition that was added on in 1895. This part of the building was done and designed in an Italian Renaissance Revival style, and there are 6 different types of Italian marble that were used to construct this portion. At the time, though, there weren't many craftsmen here in America who were used to building with marble, so aside from sending over the raw materials, a small army of workers came over from Italy, built this part of the building, and settled in the neighborhood next door. And that's when the North End became the Italian neighborhood here in Boston. The sculpture of William Francis Bartlett is one of 3 on the property sculpted by Daniel Chester French. French is probably best known for his Minuteman statue out in Lexington and also the Lincoln Memorial down in Washington, D.C. Bartlett was a major general during the Civil War. In fact, he was one of the youngest, appointed a major general at the age of 24. During the war, he was one of the few generals who would actually lead his troops in battle instead of riding up along behind them. He was involved in 5 major battles and wounded at 4 of them. He was once wounded so badly they had to amputate his leg. Once he recovered from this, he would still lead his troops. He'd have his men tie him to his horse. The Southern officers were so impressed with his bravery that the order was given not to shoot at him. At the end of the war, he was one of the first leading officials from the North to call for reconciliation between the North and the South. A lot of politicians and military figures from the North wanted to punish the South, but Bartlett felt that if the war was about preserving the Union, that the Union would have to be preserved. He was also asked to run for governor by both the Democrats and the Republicans here in Massachusetts. He turned them both down. He died at the age of 36 as a result from his various war injuries. The Civil War Nurses Memorial was unveiled in 1914, and it honors all of the women who served as nurses for Massachusetts regiments during the Civil War. It was the first piece of artwork in the building to honor the role of women in Massachusetts history, and also the first piece of artwork in the country to honor the role of nurses during warfare. And though there is not a particular nurse portrayed in the statue, among the women who did serve as nurses for Massachusetts, Dorothea Dix, who was the superintendent of all nurses during the Civil War, Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross, and Louisa May Alcott, the author, were all nurses during the Civil War. The three murals at the top of Nurses Hall show three different events at the beginning of the American Revolution. The first painting shows Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, where he rode through the streets warning that the British troops were on the move. At the other end, there's a mural showing the Boston Tea Party, where the colonists who were fed up with high taxes went down to the harbor and dumped tea into the water to protest. The center mural shows James Otis arguing against the writs of assistance. The writs of assistance was one of the laws that the British forced on the colonists, allowing British soldiers to invade homes and businesses without a search warrant. Otis was arguing against this, unfortunately in front of a British judge and a British court, so needless to say he lost his case. But listening to him speak that day were John Hancock and John and Samuel Adams, and they used a lot of Otis's arguments when they were drafting the Bill of Rights. John Adams wrote in his journal that the spark of the revolution was ignited the day that Otis gave the speech. Memorial Hall was designed to be a place of remembrance in honor of Massachusetts veterans. The stained glass skylight shows the 13 seals of the 13 original states. Massachusetts is located in the center, and the other 12 circle around it. The room also contains 4 large paintings. The first painting shows the Pilgrims' arrival at Plymouth Rock. The second shows the scene at the start of the American Revolution at the Battle at Old North Bridge. And if you look at the painting, you can make out 2 important details about the war. The colonists were just farmers who put down their plows, picked up their guns, went off to battle. They were known as Minutemen because they were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice. Also in the distance, through the cloud of smoke, you can just barely make out the red coats of the British. That was to prove to their disadvantage because it made them very easy targets. The third mural shows John Eliot preaching to Algonquin Indians. Eliot was a missionary. He came over and translated the Bible into different Native American languages. Massachusetts is an Algonquin word, and it means by the foot of the great hills, and they're referring to the Blue Hills which run through Milton and Canton, just south of Boston. The final mural shows a very special occasion. It's one of the 3 occasions that open up the front doors of the building. The front center doors of the State House are only opened by tradition 3 times. If the sitting President of the United States or a foreign head of state were to come and visit, they would enter the building through the front center doors. The governor, on their last day in office, will exit the building through the open center doors. They'll walk from their office upstairs, down through all the public halls on the 2nd floor, and then out for the final time. The third occasion is what's shown in this painting. It's the returning of the colors at the end of a war, when the Massachusetts soldiers bring their regimental flags back to present them back to the governor. This particular occasion portrayed is at the end of the Civil War, so it's Governor Andrew who's receiving the regimental flags. Memorial Hall at one time was the home to all of those flags when they came back, and at one point there was about 470 flags on display in this room. The problem was the flags were in the open air. They were stored in these alcoves, which were fairly small. Many of the flags had to be rolled up, which is not good for their preservation. So they are now stored in vaults in the basement, kept flat to try and help preserve them. There are photographs around the room showing some of the flags to give people an idea of what we have in our collection. The 2 flags in the front corner are 2 of the oldest flags we have in the collection, both dating from the American Revolution. The red flag was actually a British regimental flag captured by colonists who did not have a flag of their own, so they ripped the British symbols off of it and used it as their own flag. The flag that's next to that is backwards, and this is because at the time, prior to 1777, there were not regulations as to what the design of the flag was to look like exactly, what direction the stripes would go in, what arrangement the stars could be in. It was up to the seamstress making the flag. It just needed to have these components. And back then, since money and material could be scarce, sometimes flags only had designs on one side. The other side would be blank. After 1777, even if it was a one-sided flag, it would still be oriented in the way that we're used to seeing the flag today. The 4 flags on the east side of the room are all regimental flags from the Civil War. The white flag is the regimental flag of the 54th Regiment. That was the all-black regiment during the Civil War. The green flag is the flag of the Irish 9th, and they just had a ceremony here last week on St. Patrick's Day where they placed a wreath in front of that flag. Great Hall is the most recent addition to the State House. It was completed in 1990. It was added to provide more meeting and function space to the building. One of the room's most notable features are the flags that line the walls. We're in the process of collecting the flags from all the cities and towns in Massachusetts. Of the 351 cities and towns, we have all the flags but 31. We are still in the process of collecting them and hope to get them in by the end of this year. Another main feature to the room is the clock that hangs from the ceiling. The clock was designed by a New York artist named R.M. Fisher, and it's a collection of various symbols and icons of Massachusetts. The clock body is supposed to resemble the lantern that Paul Revere used on his ride. The ring above the clock face is supposed to resemble a lighthouse ring. And the clock is capped off with a dome with the pine cone on top of it, just like the State House. The stained glass window behind me shows the history of the Massachusetts State Seal. The seal serves as the symbol of the Commonwealth and officializes documents. The very first state seal is up at the top of the center window. It was used as a propaganda tool to try and get more British settlers to come over to the colonies. It was designed by an Englishman who had never been over to Massachusetts. It shows a very British-looking Native American wearing a tropical grass skirt with tropical trees behind him. The banner over his head says, "Come over and help us." That's the last thing that the natives wanted. New England is far from a tropical climate, but it worked and the British settlers came over. The four seals under that and the seals that line the side windows are the seals of the royal governors. Before we were a country of our own, we were just a collection of colonies of England, so the king would decide who our governor would be. We'd use that man's family crest as our seal. All that changed at the time of the American Revolution, and what's at the bottom of the center window became our seal. It shows the Minuteman Patriot with an upraised sword in one hand and the Magna Carta in the other. And the upraised sword is there to symbolize that it's a time of war or a time of aggression. And it's from this seal that we get our state motto, which is written around it in Latin and very loosely translates to, "By the sword we seek peace, but peace only under liberty." At the end of the war, our seal evolved into what it still is today, just above it in the center of the main window, the Great Seal, designed in 1780. The seal press, by the way, was designed by Paul Revere, another thing he had his hand in here. This seal shows a more realistically portrayed native. His arrow is pointing downward because we're at peace, and the star over his shoulder is there to symbolize that we're one of the 13 original states. Behind me is a statue of Governor Roger Walcott. He was the governor of Massachusetts during the Spanish-American War. It's another piece that's sculpted by Daniel Chester French. You may notice a certain similarity in this sculpture to the Lincoln Memorial down in DC, also done by the same artist. Lincoln didn't like to have full-length artwork of himself done, as I mentioned at the beginning of the tour, so there weren't many models that French could rely on when he was sculpting it. Walcott was also fairly tall, so he served as one of the models for that, so there's a slight resemblance in this piece here. It's largely due to his time, though, as a member of the House that this sculpture is placed here. In the 1880s, while he was a member of the House of Representatives, this part of the building did not yet exist. It was just the front, the Bullfinch section from 1798. That part of the building had fallen into a lot of disrepair and had a lot of heavy use and abuse going on. And there was debate as to whether they should restore the building, knock the building down, build a new building here, knock the building down, or just abandon it and move the capital somewhere else in the state. And even though no other location was picked as that other location, somewhere else was gaining popularity. Walcott was from Boston and wanted to keep the capital here in Boston for all of its service that it did to the state and the country during the Revolution. This room is the House of Representatives chamber. The House is the larger of the two legislative bodies here in the state. There are 160 members. They sit here at these desks. Down at the front of the room is where the Speaker sits. The Speaker is elected by the other members in the House to preside over the sessions and moderate the debate. When the House is in session, the room is still open for the public. You just need to come in the public galleries upstairs. The galleries are only open, though, when they are in session. There's a large gallery reserved for the public, a gallery reserved for the press, and a gallery reserved for visiting guests of the Speaker or special dignitaries. They have two types of sessions here in the House, a formal session and an informal session. The state constitution requires that they must have a session every 72 hours. We're one of the last of the full-time legislatures here in the country. At the informal sessions, generally there are fewer members here, there are less controversial items brought up, because at the informal sessions, the members are not allowed to debate. Things either have to pass or be defeated unanimously. At the formal sessions, that's where you'll find the majority of the membership here, you'll find roll call votes, debate going on, major issues come up at the formal sessions. Since there are so many members, the way that they vote is electronically. At the front of the room, there are two large boards that, when lit, display the names of all the representatives in the chamber. Back at each of their seats, they have a set of buttons that they can press when voting. They press the green button for a yes vote, the red button for a no vote, and a green or a red light will appear down next to their name. The white button clears the board so they can vote on the next issue, and the black button indicates that they need a page. Pages sit down below in the four chairs in front of the speaker's rostrum, and they'll run messages and errands for the representatives while they're in session so they don't miss debate or miss a vote. On the rostrum itself is an excerpt from the speech that John Kennedy delivered when he visited the State House prior to going down to Washington, D.C. in 1961. Hanging above the public gallery is a large 5-foot sculpted wooden codfish. The codfish was presented to the members of the House by a man named Jonathan Rowe. Rowe's Wharf along the waterfront is named for his family. He was a fisherman, and he gave them this symbol to remind them of the importance of fishermen and the fishing industry, and that they should always vote in favor of it. The fish became kind of their unofficial good luck charm, their mascot, and it was rumored that if the fish was not hanging in the chamber, that the House would refuse to meet. That proved somewhat true. In the early 1930s, the fish was stolen by students at Harvard University, who snuck it out of the building in a large flower box, and for 3 days they kept it hidden. It's important that the 3-day deadline, since the House did not miss one of its 72-hour requirements to meet, but for those 3 days they did refuse to conduct business aside from discussing the codnapping that had happened. It was pretty quickly determined who the students were based on that box. There was an off-duty policeman who was in the building on his personal business and noticed someone leaving with a 5-foot floral box. He decided, once the news came out that the 5-foot sculpted fish was missing, that that's probably how they got it out. He started an investigation contacting the box factories in Chelsea, found out that a special box had been ordered by students at the Harvard Lampoon. The police were then able to pressure the administration at Harvard to put pressure on the students to return the fish. We are now back in the 213-year-old section of the building above where we began the tour. And back in 1798, this room was the Senate chamber. This is where the Senate met. The House met in the room just across the hall. In 1895, when the addition was added, the House moved to the large chamber we just came from, and the Senate vacated this room and took over the old House across the way. This room is now used for different small meetings, press conferences, coalitions that the senators put together. The room underwent a major restoration back in the 1970s to try and make it look as much as possible like it did in 1798. They brought in X-ray machines, looked at the different layers of paint. They brought in all sorts of art and furniture experts to gauge the authenticity of the pieces in the room. So this is as close to 1798 as possible, with a few exceptions. The most notable is the floor. They had no idea what the original floor covering looked like. And someone noticed there was a painting of the Supreme Court Chief Justice and his wife at home in 1802. And they were seated in their parlor. There was a bit of rug painted at the bottom of the painting, so they decided to copy that. So this rug is a copy of the rug that was in that painting. Another exception is the large table. At one point in time, it was thought the table was original, going back to 1798, but back when they were doing that research in the 70s, they found out some of the paperwork didn't add up. So it's unclear when the table actually arrived. The tabletop is divided up into 13 uneven pie pieces, which they believe to represent the 13 original states by size, but again, they're not exactly sure. The room also contains the only original columns left in the building. When the building was first constructed, all of the columns were made from pine trees. They were chopped down up in Maine, carved in the front lawn, and put in place throughout the building. In the early 1900s, though, most of the columns, all of the load-bearing ones, had to be replaced from wood to plaster and iron. These 4, though, still remain. The portraits in the room are all portraits of former Senate presidents. The Senate president is the presiding officer of the Senate. One notable is the full-length portrait in the back corner, which is Calvin Coolidge. Now, he was from Vermont, but he started his political career here in Massachusetts. He started as a city councilor out in Northampton, moved up to become mayor, state rep, state senator, senate president, lieutenant governor, governor, vice president, and president, all in 26 years. One trivia note about the room: when Charles Bulfinch was designing it, he asked the senators if they had any special requests about their chamber. Most of them had business down at the waterfront, either in fishing or trade, so they asked if they could have a nice view of Boston Harbor. So Bulfinch obliged them by putting in large Palladian windows. From this room back in 1798, you had a perfectly clear view straight down to the harbor. If you look out today, you can see that Boston has grown up a lot since then. The harbor also used to be much closer. It actually extended all the way to where Faneuil Hall Market is located today. All of that land was filled in with land that they carted off from Beacon Hill here. We're now standing in the current Senate chamber. The most notable thing about this room is this is the room that's underneath the Golden Dome. Now, the dome continues up about another 50 feet from where you see the ceiling. Inside is just a spiral staircase and a crawl space leading up to the cupola. At the base of the ceiling, though, you'll notice there are leaves carved into it, and there are 360 of them going around much like the points in a compass. And that's because distance to Boston is measured from the tip of the dome. So when you see a sign along the highway saying 50 miles to Boston, you're exactly 50 miles from the center of the room here. Now, in the Senate, many of the things are similar to the House, the way they run their meetings and their schedule and such. Every 72 hours, they have to have a session. They alternate between having several informal and several formal. At the informal sessions, they're not allowed to debate. Generally, there are fewer members. The formal sessions will have generally the full body, roll call votes, and debate. Another major difference involves the way that they vote. They don't have the electronic system of voting that the House does. There are only 40 members, so they still call each senator's name, and they verbally have to respond either yes or no. The Senate chamber is open to visitors while they're having a session. They have two public galleries, one on either side of the room, an area reserved for the press, an area reserved for staff members, and an area reserved for visiting dignitaries. At the front of the room is where the Senate President presides from. She will moderate the debate and preside over the sessions. Going around the room, there are busts of famous Americans. We have George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Franklin, and the gentleman to the right of the doorway is the only foreigner to be honored here in the State House. That's the Marquis de Lafayette. He was a Frenchman, and he was a close friend and supporter of George Washington during the American Revolution, both financially and militarily. And it was his wish when he died, he wanted to be buried in American soil because he loved America so much. He died in France. He was also a hero to the French people, so they did not want to send his body back over here. So we sent crate loads of dirt from Bunker Hill over to France. So he's buried in American soil. There's a US flag that flies over his grave 24 hours a day. And depending who you ask, he was either the first or the second person to be granted honorary citizenship to the United States. Up above the large chandelier, you'll notice there's another fish. That fish is here because this used to be the House chamber. 213 years ago, the House met in this room. The sacred cod used to hang in this room. When the House moved out, they brought the sacred cod with them. The senators moved in, were a little upset to find that the fish was gone. They thought they were going to inherit that with the room. So they installed their own fish above the chandelier. Some of the senators like to joke and call it the holy mackerel, but they do all take pride in the fact that this fish has never been stolen. On the desk in front of each senator's seat are several piles of paper. One pile is the calendar of the Senate, which lists what's upcoming at future sessions, roughly the order in which bills will be taken up. The other is the journal, which is an ongoing written record of what has happened at previous sessions. It's compiled by the clerk. It contains all of the debate, all of the record of votes, and so on. The pages are tied together, though, with red ribbon. And this is a tradition that's held over from the British Parliament. And it's from this tradition that the expression getting tied up in red tape comes from. Behind me is the executive suite, which is where you'll find the offices of Governor Patrick, Lieutenant Governor Murray, and the Governor's Council Chamber. You'll also find the portraits of the most recent former governors. Now, the offices are private working offices, so the tour does not go in there, but we can take a look in the lobby to see the portraits. That concludes our tour of the State House. I'm John O'Brien, and I've enjoyed showing you around the building this morning. Thank you, and I hope to see you again here real soon.